Welcome to Teatime Oddities, the podcast where we explore the strange and the unusual throughout history. I'm your host Danielle, and today we will be discussing Phineas Gage. So, pop the kettle on and grab a warm cup of tea, and let's get started. Welcome back to the podcast, guys. I hope everyone's doing well, and I'm very excited to say this is the 5th episode of the podcast, which means we have been doing this podcast for 5 months, which is a really big milestone for me because I didn't know if I was going to be able to keep up with it. But I want to thank you guys for listening to the podcast, as well as the support I've gotten from my friends and my family and also other podcast creators. So thank you guys so much. Today's episode, we are going to be discussing Phineas Gage, which I'm sure if you've taken any type of psychology class or just love history, I'm sure you've heard of this man. It is a story that I've been fascinated with for a long time, and I thought it was only right to have it featured on the podcast. The tea that I'm drinking today is a Christmas-related tea, which I know it is February, but I just was drawn to this one. It has like an apple-y taste to it. It also has that like generic pink bubblegum taste. Like the aftertaste is generic pink bubblegum, which sounds disgusting, but I don't know. Something about it, I can't stop drinking it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Phineas Gage was born around the 9th of July, 1823 in Grafton County, New Hampshire. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Hannah and Jesse Gage. Most of his early life is unaccounted for, but it was known that he was able to read and write, which wasn't always the case for people at this time. His notoriety mainly comes from an incident that took place while he was working for the Hudson River Railroad. He was employed by the railroad to be the blasting foreman, which is the guy who handles the explosives and getting them set up. His employees described him as a wise and shrewd businessman. He was very committed to his job. He even had a custom tamping iron, which is a large iron rod used to compact the explosives. On September 13th, 1848, Gage was directing an explosion for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. While he was setting up the explosion, he placed the blasting powder and the fuse into the blasting hole. The blasting hole is just 2 rock formations with a hole or a burrow between them that they place all the explosives into. So it's not a big space, it's a very narrow and long space. So you can imagine he's kind of smushed into this little hole trying to put all the stuff into it, and he was distracted by some of the other workers, so he turned his head to look at them. And as he turned his head, the tamping iron, the large iron rod that he used, created a spark, which unfortunately caused an explosion to occur. Almost in an instant, the tamping iron blew out of the hole and went straight through Gage's head. The tamping iron, just for reference, which I know this is kind of gross, I'm sorry in advance, so just graphic warning here. It was 1 1/4 inches thick, 3 feet long, and weighed about 13 pounds. So that went through his skull, and it went clean through. It did not stop. The iron actually landed 80 feet away from the explosion, while Gage himself landed a few feet back. The various descriptions of this event can get quite graphic, but I'm just going to stick to most of the basic info. There is going to be some parts that are kind of nasty, so just be warned of that. Almost minutes after the explosion, Gage was able to speak and walk with assistance. Gage acted as if almost nothing had occurred, and some people even said that while on the way to his house, he was writing down times and the wages owed to his employees, which is kind of crazy when you think about the fact that there was a gigantic hole in this guy's head. The first doctor who treated Gage was Dr. Edward Williams, and he said that when he had arrived to Gage's home, he was sitting on the front porch, just kind of chilling there. And here's another graphic warning, because this one is especially graphic. You may want to skip ahead a few seconds. When Dr. Williams arrived at the house, he began observing Gage's wounds and kind of asking him what had happened. And Gage began talking about what had occurred, but the doctor did not even believe what he was saying. He thought, the head injury had caused him to become confused. This is a direct quote from Dr. Williams' notes. Mr. G got up and vomited. The effort of vomiting pressed out about a half teacupful of the brain through the exit hole at the top of the skull, which fell upon the floor. Honestly, when I read that the first time, my skin was just crawling. Like, that is the most disgusting but also crazy thing I've ever heard in my life. Later that evening, Dr. John Harlow actually took over Gage's case. Dr. Harlow had actually known Gage prior to this incident, so he was more familiar with his medical history and whatnot. Dr. Harlow described Gage before the accident as a perfectly healthy, strong, and active young man, 25 years of age, 5 feet 6 inches in height, average weight 150 pounds, possessing an iron will as well as an iron frame. However, after this horrific incident, Gage was never the same. Not only did this incident come with obvious physical damage to him, he also had mental damage as well. Only days after the incident, Gage would go through periods of hysteria and then return to normal. Later, he fell into a coma for around 10 days. By December, Dr. Harlow writes that Gage had improved mentally and physically. But if you know anything about the brain, the massive damage that occurred to Gage's frontal lobe greatly affected his life. The frontal lobe controls our voluntary movement, communication, memory, attention, and various other things. It is a very important part of how we interact with others, and it just makes us who we are. Gage's behavior after the incident would be described as inappropriate. Many of the stories that talk about Gage's behavior after the incident are often exaggerated. The only real written account that we have that's at least, verified is a quote from Dr. Harlow that states, Gage was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little difference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, a child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations. He has the animal passions of a strong man. His mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. Which, again, when I read this quote for the first time, it was kind of chilling to hear someone be described as no longer themselves. And maybe it's just the fancy language that these people use, but I don't know. It kind of freaked me out. The affected area of his brain was responsible for a lot of emotional processing and rational decision making, so this kind of contributes to this new quote-unquote personality that people were seeing. So his extreme change in personality is not something that's uncommon with brain damage of this sort, but it had never really been seen before. I didn't even really get into the fact that Gage surviving this incident was crazy. I mean, we're talking about the 1800s here where medical advances were getting to, a good place, but they definitely weren't like today's standards. So the fact that he did not die of, say an infection or blood loss or something else is kind of insane. The shocking nature of Gage's accident and as well as his recovery did not go unnoticed at this time either. After this whole thing, he actually traveled around New England and displayed himself as a curiosity in Barham's circus. He later would go to Europe and work in New Hampshire and Chile for a bit. He kind of bounced around a while, just getting different jobs in various places, but unfortunately, Gage had to return to his mother's home and live with her as his health was declining. Phineas Gage unfortunately died after a series of epileptic seizures on May 21st, 1860. This was about 12 years after the accident, and he was only 37 years old. Gage's brother actually gave his skull as well as the iron rod to Dr. Harlow, who would later donate them both to Harvard, which is actually where you can still see both his skull and the iron rod today. I think it's a little creepy that this poor man's skull is on display for everyone to see, but I do understand that Gage had a large impact on neuroscience and psychology those things that we've learned are still seen even today. I mean, as I talked about it before, I heard about Gage in my psychology class. Although some of Gage's story after the incident is greatly exaggerated, I do want to say I don't have any, exact stories of how he acted. So I don't want people to think this guy just kind of went bananas, because the only real verified quote, as I said earlier, was Dr. Harlow's quote about him not being Gage anymore. I think maybe sometimes people take it a little too far. I do want to be respectful of the fact that this man went through a great tragedy, something I could not think of going through myself, and he still managed to work and make a life for himself, whether or not it was always exactly how it should have been. But he did his best, and I honestly can't. I respect this man greatly. And I want everyone to remember Gage not just for his skull in a museum and an iron rod. I want people to remember him as a successful businessman who unfortunately experienced an extreme trauma, but he was not forgotten to time, but rather his story lives on. And even in this podcast, he lives on. I think that this man's horrible experience has brought to light a lot of, important advances in science. And I think that's a great thing, but I don't think it's a great thing that he had to go through the trauma. So I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to articulate my words well, but kind of, fumbling a little. Thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast today. You can find a full list of my sources in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram at Teatime Oddities. I post photos related to the episodes as well as odd stories in the middle of the month before the next episode. So if you want just a little snippet of some odd story, head on over to my Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Teatime Oddities. Make sure to keep the kettle on and check in next month for another episode. Goodbye.